There's another study, and this is all cited in the booklet, indicating what could be accomplished in terms of healthcare costs if we could reduce the medical costs of institutionalized living, and if we could enable more disabled people to, seniors and individuals with disabilities, to participate in the labor force. And this study estimates almost $1 trillion in healthcare savings, which is approximately half of our total national expenditure on healthcare. Now, in Indiana, after the legislation was passed in March of 2006, in the 6 months after the legislation passed, 2,200 jobs were created. I'm citing the Ball State study here, and again, it's referred to in the booklet. $516 million was invested. There were 400,000 new high-speed lines that were installed, which was a 33% increase over the 6-month period before. Now, investors are willing to invest in broadband. This is a proven investment. It's profitable. It's profitable unless there's a possibility that regulators are going to force it to subsidize plain old traditional basic analog phone service. To the extent that there's a threat that that's going to happen, it becomes unpredictable and problematic from an investment standpoint. And the reforms that I'd like to address next are really the reforms that need to occur on the wireline traditional analog phone service side of the equation. And that's because if companies like AT&T, Verizon, Qwest, and BARC cannot offer a competitive service, they cannot maintain the stock valuations necessary to attract private investment to invest in broadband. Now, we should recall that incumbent local telephone companies were able to invest in their wireless networks because investors invested in that risky, unproven technology based on the strength of those companies' wireline businesses and their wireline revenues. And the situation we're in today is those companies need to be able to rely on their wireline and wireless revenues in order to attract investment to invest in broadband. And so what are some of these problem areas? Now, the first one is repealing discriminatory taxes. Nationwide, on average, there's a study which says that communications providers pay on average 13.4% in additional taxes, whereas retail sales taxes nationwide average only 6.61%. Taxes of telephone service are roughly comparable in most jurisdictions to taxes on alcohol and tobacco. And now this made perfect sense in a monopoly environment because ratepayers were captives. There was no substitute for the service. There were no competitors who were able to avoid paying the taxes. So consumers had to pay the taxes, and there was really no problem. But we're in a situation today where that's not the case. Now, fortunately, Ohio and Virginia are two states which have been leaders in this area and have attempted to reform and rationalize these taxes which lead to distortions in the market. VoIP services, for example, may not pay any tax at all. Telephone service would pay more than this 13.4% average usually. And video services that are downloaded over the internet may not pay any taxes at all. So these are examples of some of the distortions. You have to do an analysis to determine how cable, voice service, and wireless would compare with wireline. Typically, wireline is going to be at the top. Wireless is going to be somewhere in between. And VoIP services frequently may not pay any taxes at all. Really what we recommend is the taxes ought to be based on the economic cost. Well, for example, let's talk about a franchise fee that a cable provider would pay. It ought to be based on the cost of the use of the right-of-way. I mean, the direct costs to the local jurisdiction of the use of the right-of-way. But instead, what it's based on today is what the market will bear. It's generating additional revenue. So the next issue I'd like to address is network neutrality. Now, this isn't an issue where existing regulation or statutes need to be stripped away, but rather this is kind of a cautionary area where there are parties who would like to apply common carrier regulation to broadband services, which is what broadband was subject to prior to some recent Supreme Court ruling and FCC action. And the current state of this right now is that the FCC promulgated 4 principles, which include providing consumers with the right to competition between providers. And in the economic stimulus package, these 4 principles were codified there. If anyone applies for any of that money, they would be subject to these 4 principles. But providing consumers with the right to competition between providers is very different than providing competitors the right to a level playing field, which is really a mythical concept in any event. A truly level playing field is impossible as a practical matter to ever create. And to the extent that we try to ensure that the extent that we use universal service, common carriage, to try to ensure that no competitor pays more than another competitor for an equal service. For example, we limit the right of service providers to experiment with new pricing and service, customized offerings. And the net result is that diminishes the attractiveness of these services from an investment perspective. There is no natural synergy between content and conduit. So in other words, the fear is that communications networks will be like cable systems, where the provider provides the conduit, also provides the content, and consumers can take it or leave it. But if you have the best content, really you want it on everybody's network. And if you have the best network, really you want to have everyone's content on it in order to beat your competition. The most profitable, if you look at the cable TV industry, really the least profitable service they provide is cable television. Telephone service is more profitable, and their broadband service offerings are their most profitable.